The wind screamed across the plains of rural Kansas like it was trying to tear the world apart. Rain hammered down in sheets so thick you couldn't see 5 feet ahead. Inside a rusted mobile home that had seen better decades, Martha and Henry Caldwell huddled together on their threadbare couch, listening to their entire world shake on its failing foundation. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. Martha was 73, small-framed with silver hair pulled back in a bun that had long since given up trying to look neat. Her hands, gnarled with arthritis, clutched a faded quilt her mother had made 60 years ago. The fabric was worn thin in places, patches upon patches telling the story of a lifetime of make-do and mend. Beside her, Henry sat hunched forward, his weathered face lit by the glow of a single kerosene lamp. At 76, he'd worked construction for 50 years until his body finally said no. The doctors called it degenerative disc disease and osteoarthritis. Henry called it the price of honest labor. Now his hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from age and a lifetime of hard labor that had rewarded him with nothing but worn-out joints and an empty bank account. They'd been married for 52 years. They'd raised 3 children in homes that always seemed one paycheck away from foreclosure. They'd survived recessions, layoffs, medical bills that buried them deeper than any grave, and the kind of poverty that doesn't make headlines because it's too common, too quiet, too ordinary. Their children had moved away years ago, scattered across the country like seeds thrown to the wind, chasing jobs and better lives. Calls came on birthdays and holidays, brief and polite, but the distance wasn't just measured in miles. It was measured in unanswered questions and uncomfortable silences, in the way their daughter Claire's voice changed when she talked about her childhood, in the way their son Michael sent money instead of visits, in the way their youngest, Thomas, had stopped calling altogether 3 years ago. The mobile home groaned, a deep metallic sound that vibrated through the floor and into their bones. Metal screamed against metal, the walls shuddered. Martha flinched as something outside crashed and shattered, the sound cutting through even the roar of the storm. "Henry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "I don't think we're going to make it through this one." Henry reached over and took her hand, his grip still strong despite everything else that had failed him. His thumb traced the familiar pattern of her knuckles, the same gesture he'd made 10,000 times over 52 years. "We've made it through worse," he said, though his eyes betrayed his doubt. They'd survived a lot, yes, but nothing quite like this, nothing that sounded like the sky itself was being torn in half. They both knew this storm was different. The Weather Service had called it historic, biblical, the kind of weather that rewrote landscapes and erased the things people had built. Earlier that day, before the power had gone out, they'd watched the news on their old television, the one with the coat hanger antenna and the picture that rolled if you didn't tap it just right. The meteorologist, a young woman with perfect hair and frightened eyes, had said things like unprecedented and life-threatening and seek shelter immediately. But where were people like them supposed to seek shelter? They had no car. It had died 3 months ago, and they couldn't afford to fix it. They had no family nearby. The closest was Michael in Denver, 600 miles away. They had no money for a hotel. They had nowhere to go except right here, in this metal box that was older than some of their grandchildren, held together with rust and prayers and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, luck would hold one more time. Then came the sound that changed everything. A deep, wrenching crack followed by the shriek of tearing metal. The entire mobile home lurched violently to one side. Martha screamed, her hands flying out to grab anything stable, but there was nothing stable anymore. Henry pulled her close as the walls around them began to buckle. The ceiling groaned, then split. The roof peeled away like paper, exposing them to the full fury of the storm. Rain poured in, cold and merciless. The lamp fell and shattered, plunging them into darkness broken only by lightning that turned the world white and terrible. Out! Henry shouted, his voice raw with urgency. We have to get out now! They stumbled toward what used to be the door, now just a twisted frame hanging at an angle. Henry's bad back screamed with every movement, but adrenaline pushed him forward. Martha's arthritic hands couldn't grip properly, so Henry gripped her, his arm around her waist, half carrying her as they pushed through the opening and into the storm. The wind hit them like a physical force, trying to knock them off their feet. Rain soaked them instantly, cold water running down their faces, into their eyes, their mouths. Martha sobbed, but the sound was swallowed by the roar around them. Behind them, their home, their only shelter, their only possession, collapsed inward with a sound like the world ending. 52 years of marriage, 73 and 76 years of life, reduced to twisted metal and splintered particle board in seconds. They stumbled forward blindly into the screaming darkness. Henry didn't know where they were going. He just knew they had to move, had to get away from the collapsing structure, had to find something, anything. His boots sank into mud with every step. Martha's thin house shoes were already gone, lost somewhere in the first few yards, and she was walking barefoot through the storm. "I can't," she gasped, her legs giving out. "Henry, I can't." "Yes, you can," he said fiercely, holding her upright. "We're not dying tonight, Martha. We're not." They had nowhere to go, no family nearby, no friends with room to spare. The nearest town was 12 miles away, and they had no car. They were alone in the middle of nowhere as the storm tried to kill them. Two old people who had survived everything life threw at them, now facing the very real possibility that this was how their story ended. Then, through the rain and darkness, Henry saw it. A faint glimmer of light, pale and ghostly, about 200 yards away across an open field. At first he thought it was lightning reflecting off something, but it stayed steady, glowing softly like a lantern in the void, like hope manifesting in the darkness. "Martha!" he shouted over the wind, his mouth close to her ear. "There! Do you see it?" She squinted, rain pouring down her face, plastering her gray hair to her skull. "What is it?" "I don't know," Henry said, "but it's shelter. It has to be. Come on!" They stumbled across the muddy field, each step a battle against the wind and their own failing bodies. Martha fell once, her knees hitting the mud hard, and for a moment Henry thought she wouldn't get back up. But she did. She always did. That was who Martha was, the woman who got back up. They'd lost houses before, lost jobs, lost opportunities, but they'd never lost each other, and they weren't starting now. Henry hauled her to her feet, his old back protesting, vertebrae grinding against bone, but he didn't care. Pain was nothing. Pain was familiar. They kept moving, drawn toward that strange pale light like moths to a flame, like the desperate to salvation. As they got closer, the shape emerged from the darkness, a large greenhouse, maybe 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, its transparent panels glowing faintly in the storm. It sat at the edge of what looked like an abandoned farm, surrounded by overgrown weeds and the skeletal remains of old equipment, a rusted tractor, a collapsed fence, the bones of agriculture left to decay. The structure itself looked old but intact, its frame still solid, its panels still mostly whole. It was the kind of hot tent farmers used to use for extending growing seasons, with thick plastic panels and a peaked roof designed to shed snow and rain. Henry pulled open the door. It resisted at first, swollen from moisture and disuse, but then gave way with a groan. They tumbled inside, collapsing onto the dirt floor. The sound of the storm immediately softened, muffled by the thick plastic and glass panels. It was still loud, still terrifying, but at least they were out of the rain. At least they could breathe. They lay there for a long time, gasping, shivering, too exhausted to move. Henry's chest heaved with each breath, his heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape. Martha curled on her side, her whole body shaking, from cold, from shock, from the overwhelming reality of what had just happened. Eventually, Martha rolled onto her side and looked around. The greenhouse was mostly empty, just dirt floors, some old wooden benches along the walls, and the skeletal remains of long-dead plants, their dried stems and leaves scattered across the ground like ancient bones. A few clay pots lay broken in corners, some rusted tools hung from nails on the wooden frame, but it was dry. The roof was intact. Compared to the collapsing nightmare they'd just escaped, it felt like a palace. "We made it," she whispered, though her voice cracked with emotion, with the weight of everything they'd just lost. Henry sat up slowly, every muscle in his body aching. His hands were bleeding. He hadn't even noticed when that happened, and his left knee felt swollen, probably twisted when he'd fallen. "We made it," he echoed, but his eyes were distant, already seeing beyond survival to the impossible question that came next. Now what? They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Through the translucent panels they could see lightning flash, turning the world momentarily white. Thunder rolled across the plains like artillery fire. The greenhouse shuddered with each gust of wind, but it held. Whatever else had failed them, this structure, this forgotten relic, was holding. "Henry," Martha said quietly, "what are we going to do?" He didn't answer right away. What could he say? Their home was gone. Their savings, what little they had, wouldn't cover a security deposit on even the cheapest apartment. They had no car, no phone service out here, no way to call for help even if help existed. Social Security checks came on the 3rd of the month, and today was the 27th. They had maybe $40 to their names, and most of that was in quarters and dimes saved in a jar that was now buried under twisted metal somewhere behind them. They were homeless. At 73 and 76 years old, after a lifetime of work and struggle and barely hanging on, they were homeless. "I don't know," Henry finally admitted, his voice rough. "But we're alive. That's something." Martha pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. Somehow, miraculously, she'd managed to hold on to it through everything. "This place," she said, looking around. "Do you think anyone owns it?" "Probably," Henry said, "but they haven't been here in years by the look of it. Maybe they won't mind if we stay for a night, just until the storm passes." But they both knew the storm was the least of their problems. The real storm, the one made of poverty and age and the brutal indifference of a world that had no use for old people without money. That storm had been raging for years, and it wasn't going to pass. The storm raged through the night, and they huddled together on the dirt floor, wrapped in the single quilt Martha had managed to grab before their home collapsed. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? Instead, they held each other, drawing warmth from proximity, drawing strength from 52 years of shared survival. When dawn finally came, it arrived gray and exhausted, the clouds still heavy but the violence gone. The rain had softened to a drizzle. Henry and Martha stepped outside to survey the damage, and what they saw made Martha's knees buckle. Their mobile home was unrecognizable, just a twisted pile of metal and splintered wood. The aluminum siding had been torn away and scattered across the field. The frame had collapsed in on itself. Everything they owned, every photo, every memory, every scrap of their lives was buried in that wreckage or scattered across the muddy field. Martha stood there, staring, her face blank with shock. She'd known it was bad, but seeing it in daylight made it real in a way the darkness hadn't. Henry put his arm around her, and they stood in silence, two old people who had nothing left, watching the sun struggle to break through the clouds. A hawk circled overhead, riding the wind currents, hunting for prey the storm had displaced. Life went on. The world kept turning, but for Martha and Henry, everything had stopped. "What do we do now?" Martha finally asked, her voice small and broken, like a child's. Henry looked back at the greenhouse. It was still standing, untouched by the storm, its panels intact, its frame solid. Strange how it had survived when everything else had fallen. "I guess," he said slowly, "we live there, at least until we figure something out." Martha turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "We can't live in a greenhouse, Henry. We're not homeless people." But Henry's expression was gentle and infinitely sad. "We are now, Martha. We are now." The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. She'd spent 73 years believing that if you worked hard, if you were good, if you did everything right, life would at least give you the dignity of a roof over your head in your old age. But that promise had been a lie. Hard work didn't guarantee security. Goodness didn't prevent catastrophe. They'd done everything right. And here they were anyway, standing in the mud with nothing. They spent the rest of that first day just trying to process what had happened. Henry walked the 12 miles into town, a journey that took him nearly 4 hours with his bad back and swollen knee. He went to the local church, a small white building with a cross that needed repainting, and spoke to the pastor, a kind man named Father Tom who'd known them for years. Father Tom listened with sympathetic eyes and offered what he could: some blankets, canned food, bottles of water, and most importantly, the assurance that he wouldn't report them for squatting in the abandoned greenhouse. "Stay there as long as you need," he said, pressing 2 $20 bills into Henry's bleeding hand. "And come by the church on Sundays. We always have food after service." Henry tried to refuse the money, pride making his throat tight, but Father Tom insisted. "It's not charity, Henry. It's what neighbors do." When Henry returned to the greenhouse that evening, his feet blistered and his back screaming, he found Martha had been busy. She'd swept the dirt floor with an old broom she'd found, creating a clean space in the center. She'd arranged the wooden benches to form a kind of partition, giving them some sense of structure, of home. The clay pots, even the broken ones, were lined up neatly. It wasn't much, but it was hers. A small act of control in a situation where everything else was chaos. "Look," she said, trying to smile through exhaustion. "I found these." She held up 2 old glass jars. "We can use them for drinking water. And there's a pump outside. I tested it. The water's good." Henry set down the supplies Father Tom had given them and pulled Martha into a hug. She felt so small in his arms, so fragile. When had she gotten so thin? When had they both become so old? They made the greenhouse their home. Over the next few days, Henry patched holes in the panels with duct tape and old plastic sheets he scavenged from the ruined farm equipment. Martha organized their few possessions, the blankets, the canned goods, some clothes they'd managed to salvage from the wreckage of their mobile home. Everything was mud-stained and torn, but it was all they had. There was a hand pump well about 50 yards away that still worked, miracle of miracles, providing clean water for drinking and washing. Henry rigged up a small fire pit outside using stones from an old foundation, and they cooked their canned beans and soup over open flame like pioneers, like people from another century. It wasn't much, it wasn't even close to enough, but it was theirs, and they were alive, and some days that felt like more than they had any right to ask for. The nights were the hardest. The greenhouse wasn't insulated, and even though it was late spring, the Kansas nights could still be cold. They'd lie together on the hard dirt floor, wrapped in donated blankets, listening to the sounds of the rural darkness. Crickets sang in the tall grass. Distant coyotes howled at the moon. Trucks passed on the highway a mile away, their engines fading into silence. And sometimes, late at night, when everything else was quiet, they heard something else. It started on their 4th night there. Martha woke Henry, her hand on his shoulder, her voice urgent in the darkness. "Henry, do you hear that?" Henry listened, still groggy from sleep. At first there was nothing. Then he heard it. A low, rhythmic thumping, like something knocking against hollow wood. It came from beneath them, from under the dirt floor. Thump, thump, thump. Steady and deliberate, then silence. "What is that?" Martha whispered, fear creeping into her voice. Henry sat up slowly, his heart beginning to pound. "I don't know." They listened for several more minutes, but the sound didn't repeat, Eventually they lay back down, but neither of them slept well. Martha kept jerking awake, certain she'd heard it again. Henry stared at the translucent ceiling, watching shadows move across the panels as clouds passed over the moon. The next night, it happened again. This time, Henry was ready. The moment he heard the thumping, he grabbed the flashlight Father Tom had given them and stood up, moving quietly across the dirt floor. The sound seemed to come from the far corner, near a section of floor where the dirt looked slightly darker, more compact than the rest. "There's something under us," he said quietly. Martha huddled in her blanket, watching him. "Like what? A cellar?" "Maybe," Henry said. "Lots of old farms had root cellars for storing vegetables. Could be that." "Should we check?" Henry hesitated. Every instinct told him to leave it alone, to not go looking for trouble, but curiosity gnawed at him. And maybe, just maybe, there was something down there they could use, old tools, supplies, anything that might help them survive. "Tomorrow," he said finally. "We'll check tomorrow, in daylight." But when tomorrow came, Henry's courage wavered. He stood over the dark patch of dirt, the rusty shovel he'd found in his hands, and felt a strange reluctance. What if there was nothing? What if there was something terrible? What if opening whatever was down there made everything worse? Martha stood beside him, her hand on his arm. "We don't have to," she said softly. "We can just leave it." But Henry shook his head. They'd spent their whole lives just leaving things, just accepting whatever life handed them without question. Maybe it was time to dig deeper. Literally. "No," he said. "I need to know." He began to dig. The work was slow and painful. His back seized up after the first few shovelfuls, and his arthritic hands could barely grip the handle. But he kept going, driven by something he couldn't name. Martha watched anxiously, her hands clasped together like she was praying. After about an hour of digging, the shovel hit something solid with a hollow thunk. "Wood!" Henry knelt down and brushed away the dirt with his bleeding hands, revealing a trapdoor, old, weathered, but still remarkably intact. It was larger than he'd expected, maybe 4 feet square, made of heavy oak planks held together with iron bands. In the center was a heavy iron ring for a handle, green with age but solid. He looked up at Martha. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "This is it," he said. "What do you think is down there?" "Only one way to find out." Henry gripped the iron ring with both hands and pulled. The trapdoor resisted at first, stuck shut by decades of dirt and rust and the weight of forgotten time. He pulled harder, his back screaming in protest, his hands slipping on the metal. Then, with a deep groan that seemed to come from the earth itself, the door gave way. It swung open, revealing a dark rectangular opening and a set of wooden stairs descending into blackness. Cold air rushed out, carrying with it the smell of earth and stone and something else, something dry and old and faintly metallic, something that had been sealed away for a very long time. Henry peered down into the darkness, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. "I need light." Martha handed him the kerosene lamp, her hands shaking. Henry lit it carefully, then held it over the opening. The flickering light pushed back the shadows, revealing the stairs and, at the bottom, the edge of what looked like a large room. Stone walls, a dirt floor, and shapes. Lots of shapes, stacked and arranged with careful precision. "I'm going down," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No!" Martha grabbed his arm, fear sharp in her voice. "What if it's not safe? What if—" "Martha," he said gently, covering her hand with his, "we have nothing. If there's something down there that can help us, we need to know." She didn't let go for a long moment, but eventually her grip loosened. "Be careful, please." Henry descended slowly, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The stairs creaked but held, sturdy despite their age. Behind him, he could hear Martha breathing fast and shallow, the sound of anxiety she'd tried to hide their entire marriage. 1 step, 2, 3. The darkness seemed to press in around the small circle of lamplight. 4, 5, 6. At the bottom, he raised the lamp and looked around. And what he saw made every thought in his head disappear, replaced by a single word that echoed in the silence. Impossible. The root cellar was enormous, at least 20 feet square, with a ceiling high enough for him to stand upright. Stone walls rose on all sides, carefully mortared, professional. But it wasn't empty. Far from it. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, and on those shelves were containers of every size and shape. Glass jars filled with something that gleamed dully in the lamplight, metal boxes with latches, wooden crates with rope handles, and in the center of the room, like an altar, sat a large wooden trunk, its surface covered in decades of dust, but its corners reinforced with brass that still held a faint shine. "Henry?" Martha's voice floated down from above, tight with worry. "What do you see?" Henry couldn't answer. His throat had closed. His hands trembled so badly the lamp shook, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Slowly, like a man in a dream, he approached the nearest shelf and picked up one of the glass jars. Inside were coins, not pennies or nickels, old coins, gold coins, dozens of them. His fingers went numb. The jar slipped, but he caught it just before it hit the ground. He set it down carefully and reached for another container, this one a metal box. He opened the latch with shaking fingers. Inside, wrapped in protective plastic, were bundles of paper bills. Old bills. Hundreds. Thousands. "Henry!" Martha's voice was sharper now, edged with panic. "What's down there? Talk to me!" But Henry couldn't speak. He moved like a sleepwalker to the trunk in the center of the room and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in cloth that had once been white but had yellowed with age, were more items, jewelry that caught the lamplight and threw it back in fractured rainbows, small bars of metal that could only be gold, documents in protective sleeves, certificates with official seals. His legs gave out. He sat down hard on the dirt floor, the lamp still clutched in one hand, staring at a fortune that couldn't be real, couldn't possibly be real, but was. "Martha," he finally managed to call up, his voice strange and distant. "You need to come down here." "Why? What is it?" "Just, please, come down." He heard her descend carefully, her breathing sharp with fear. When she reached the bottom and he turned the lamp so she could see, he watched her face go through the same transformation his must have: confusion, disbelief, shock, and finally something close to terror. "Oh, my lord," she whispered, her hands flying to her mouth. "What is all this?" Henry stood slowly, his old knees protesting. Together they moved through the cellar, examining items with trembling hands, afraid to touch too much, afraid to believe what they were seeing. More jars of coins, more bundles of cash, jewelry that looked antique and valuable, small bars marked with numbers and symbols that could only mean one thing. "Henry!" Martha's voice shook. "Is this real?" "I think so," he said, though the words felt ridiculous. Things like this didn't happen to people like them. Lottery winners and treasure hunters, maybe, but not to elderly people who'd spent their entire lives scraping by, who'd just lost everything in a storm. Not to them. But it was real. The coins were heavy and cold. The gold bars left marks in the dust when you moved them. The jewelry caught the light in ways that cheap metal never could. They sat together on the dirt floor of the cellar, surrounded by what looked like a fortune, two elderly people who had spent their entire lives with nothing, who had just lost everything they had, now sitting in a room that could change everything if only they could understand what it meant, where it came from, and whether they had any right to it at all. "What do we do?" Martha finally whispered, her voice small in the underground chamber. Henry looked at her in the lamplight. His wife of 52 years, the woman who'd stood beside him through poverty and struggle and every hard thing life had thrown their way. He saw the hope dawning in her eyes, fighting with the fear. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we need to be smart. We need to find out what this is, where it came from, and whether—" He paused, the weight of the question almost too heavy to speak. "Whether it's ours to keep." Martha nodded slowly. They climbed back up the stairs together, closed the trapdoor and covered it with dirt again, their movements careful and deliberate. Neither of them spoke as they did it, but both of them understood. This secret, whatever it was, couldn't be shared. Not yet. Not until they knew what they were dealing with. That night, lying in the darkness of the greenhouse, Martha whispered, "Do you think it's a blessing or a curse?" Henry was quiet for a long time, listening to the wind move through the panels, thinking about poverty and survival and the strange ways life sometimes offers second chances. "I think," he finally said, "it's a test, and tomorrow we start figuring out how to pass it." Morning came too slowly and too fast. Martha and Henry had barely slept, their minds churning with images of what lay beneath the dirt floor. Every time one of them drifted off, they'd jerk awake, certain they'd imagined it all, that the cellar was just a dream born of desperation and exhaustion. But when dawn finally crept through the greenhouse panels, painting everything in shades of gray and gold, the mound of freshly turned earth in the corner confirmed it was real. Henry sat up first, his back a symphony of pain after another night on the hard ground. He was 76 years old, and his body reminded him of that fact every single morning. But today, the pain felt distant, muffled beneath the weight of what they'd discovered. "We need to go back down," he said quietly. Martha was already awake, had been for hours, staring at the ceiling. "I know." They ate a sparse breakfast, canned peaches and stale crackers from the church supplies, in silence. The food tasted like nothing. Everything felt suspended, like they were holding their breath underwater, waiting to surface. When they could delay no longer, Henry began uncovering the trapdoor again, brushing away the dirt they'd carefully replaced the night before. In the daylight filtering through the greenhouse panels, the iron ring looked less ominous, more ordinary, just old metal on old wood. Henry gripped it and pulled. This time the door swung open more easily, releasing that same rush of cold, earthy air. They looked at each other, a lifetime of shared understanding passing between them. Then Henry descended with the lamp, while Martha followed close behind. The cellar looked different in the morning light that filtered down through the open trapdoor, less like something from a dream and more like someone's carefully constructed vault. The stone walls were precisely laid, mortared with skill that spoke of professional craftsmanship. The shelves were cedar, expensive wood that resisted rot. Everything about the space suggested intention, planning, care. Henry approached the nearest shelf methodically, like an archaeologist approaching an ancient tomb. He picked up the first jar of coins again, holding it to the light. The coins inside gleamed with the unmistakable luster of gold. He could make out dates on some of them: 1873, 1889, 1907. These weren't just old coins. These were rare coins, the kind museums kept behind glass. "There must be 30 jars like this," Martha whispered, her voice hushed with awe and fear. "Maybe more." Henry set the jar down carefully and moved to examine the wooden crates stacked against the far wall. Each was about 2 feet square, made of solid oak with rope handles on the sides. He lifted the lid on the first one and found it packed with straw. Buried in the straw were more containers, smaller boxes wrapped in oilcloth, each one sealed with wax. With trembling fingers he unwrapped one. Inside was a leather pouch, and inside that were more gold coins, but these were different, foreign, with markings he didn't recognize. European, maybe, or Russian. Martha peered over his shoulder, her breath catching. "Henry, how much do you think all this is worth?" He shook his head slowly. "I don't know. Thousands. Hundreds of thousands." He paused, the true scope of it hitting him like a physical blow. "Maybe millions." The word hung in the air between them, impossible and terrifying. Millions. People like them didn't find millions. People like them found bills in coat pockets, quarters in couch cushions, maybe $20 in a birthday card if they were lucky. Not millions. They spent the next 2 hours examining everything methodically, trying to create some kind of inventory. Henry found an old notebook and pencil in one of the crates. Ironic that whoever had stored all this had also stored the means to catalog it and began making lists. Shelf 1. 43 jars of gold coins, various dates and denominations. Shelf 2. 37 metal boxes containing paper currency, all bills over $100, bundled in plastic wrap. Shelf 3. Jewelry boxes, 26 of them, filled with rings, necklaces, brooches, watches. Some pieces looked Victorian, others more modern but still antique. All of it heavy, substantial, real. The crates contained even more treasure, small gold bars, each one stamped with numbers and symbols, stock certificates from companies Martha vaguely recognized: General Electric, Ford Motor Company, Standard Oil. The certificates were dated from the 1920s through the 1970s. Were they still valid? Could you still claim stock from certificates that were 50 years old? And then there were the documents. These were kept in a separate trunk, a smaller one made of metal with a combination lock that had been left open. Inside were papers protected in plastic sleeves: land deeds, property titles, contracts, letters. Henry pulled one out carefully and began to read. It was a deed for farmland in Kansas dated 1968. The name on the deed made his breath catch: Walter Brennan. The property description matched where they were, or close enough that it had to be the same place. "This is it," he said, showing Martha. "This land, this greenhouse, it all belonged to someone named Walter Brennan." Martha pulled out another document, a bank statement from 1975. The account belonged to Walter Brennan. The balance made her gasp: $4,700,000, and that was just one account. "Who was he?" Martha whispered. "And why did he hide all this?" They kept searching, piecing together fragments of a life from old papers and documents. Walter Brennan had been born in 1914. He'd survived the Depression as a child, served in World War II, then made his fortune in the stock market during the 50s and 60s. By the mid-70s, he'd amassed a considerable fortune, tens of millions of dollars. Then they found the journal. It was leather-bound, tucked into the corner of the metal trunk beneath the documents. Martha pulled it out carefully, the leather soft with age, and opened to the first page. "January 1st, 1975, she read aloud, her voice trembling. "The new year brings no joy, only the certainty that everything I've feared is coming. The economy is failing, inflation is out of control, the government prints money like it's paper because it is paper, and soon it will be worth even less. I've seen this before. I was young during the Depression, but I remember men who had millions losing everything overnight because they trusted the banks. I won't make that mistake." Henry moved closer, reading over her shoulder as Martha turned the pages. The journal chronicled Walter's growing paranoia through 1975 and 76. He was convinced the American economy was on the verge of total collapse. He wrote about converting all his assets to physical commodities: gold, coins, jewelry, anything tangible that would hold value when paper money became worthless. March 14, 1975, Martha continued reading. "I've begun moving everything to the farm. The old root cellar beneath the greenhouse is perfect. No one knows it's there. I built the greenhouse myself 40 years ago, and I made sure to build it over the cellar. The entrance was hidden then, and it's still hidden now. Even if someone bought the land, they'd never know. I'm storing everything there. The coins, the gold, the documents, everything I've spent 20 years building. When the collapse comes, when the chaos ends, I'll come back. And if I don't, maybe someone else will. Someone who needs it more than I do. The entries continued through 1976, each one more desperate than the last. Walter was alone. His wife had died years earlier. His children had moved away and stopped speaking to him, driven off by his increasingly paranoid behavior. He trusted no one. He feared everyone. The last entry was dated December 3, 1976. Everything is in place. The collection is complete. 30 years of work, hidden beneath Kansas soil. If you're reading this, stranger, then I didn't make it, or I couldn't come back, or I didn't have the courage. Use it wisely. Use it better than I did. Don't let fear steal your life the way it stole mine. Martha closed the journal slowly, tears running down her weathered cheeks. He died alone, she whispered. With all this money, he died alone. Henry pulled her close. They stood there in the underground chamber, surrounded by a fortune that had bought its owner nothing but isolation and fear, and they understood something profound. Wealth without purpose was just a different kind of poverty. "We need to find out what happened to him," Henry said. "We need to know if he had family, if anyone has claim to this." "And if no one does?" Martha asked. Henry didn't answer. The question was too big, too heavy, too wrapped up in questions of morality and law and what kind of people they wanted to be. They climbed back up into the greenhouse, blinking in the bright morning sun. The world above ground felt different now, less solid, less certain. They'd spent 73 and 76 years believing they understood how the world worked, that hard work and honesty were rewarded, that poverty was the result of bad choices or bad luck. But Walter Brennan's story challenged all of that. He'd made good choices, smart choices, and it had destroyed him anyway. "I need to go into town," Henry said. "The library. We need to research this man, find out if he had heirs." "I'll come with you," Martha said. "It's 12 miles. "I'm coming with you." So they walked together, two elderly people moving slowly along the rural highway, cars occasionally passing them by. Some slowed down, drivers staring curiously at the old couple, but no one stopped. It took them nearly 5 hours, with rest breaks every mile or so for Henry's back and Martha's arthritic knees. By the time they reached the Millbrook Public Library, a small brick building that smelled of old books and lemon cleaner, it was past noon. The librarian, a woman in her 50s named Sandra, looked up from her desk and smiled. "Henry? Henry Caldwell? I haven't seen you in years." "Hello, Sandra," Henry said, suddenly aware of how they must look. Dirty clothes, mud-stained, exhausted. "We need to research someone. Property records, death certificates. Can you help?" Sandra's smile faded, replaced by concern. "Of course. Are you two okay? I heard about the storm, about your home." "We're managing," Martha said quickly. "Please, this is important." They spent the next 3 hours in the library's small reference room, surrounded by microfiche readers and old record books. Sandra helped them navigate the county property records, death certificates, census data. Slowly, Walter Brennan's life came into focus. He'd been born in 1914 in Millbrook, the son of a farmer who'd lost everything in the Depression. Walter had been smart, driven, determined never to be poor again. He'd joined the army in 1942, served in North Africa and Italy, came home in 46 decorated and damaged. He'd married a woman named Eleanor in 47. They'd had 2 children, a son, Daniel, and a daughter, Caroline. Walter had worked as an accountant initially, but he'd had a gift for seeing patterns in the stock market. By the mid-50s, he was investing his own money. By the 60s, he was wealthy. By the 70s, he was paranoid. His wife Eleanor died in 1972. After that, his paranoia accelerated. His children tried to get him help, tried to have him declared incompetent, but Walter was too smart. He knew how to appear rational when he needed to. He pushed them away, accused them of trying to steal his fortune. Eventually, they stopped trying. They moved away and never came back. Walter died on February 16, 1983. Heart attack. He was found 3 days later in his farmhouse by a neighbor who'd noticed the mail piling up. He was 68 years old. The death certificate listed no next of kin. What about his children? Martha asked. Daniel and Caroline? Sandra searched further. Daniel Brennan had died in a car accident in 1991. He'd never married, had no children. Caroline had moved to Oregon in 1978. There was a marriage license. She'd become Caroline Peters, but after that, the trail went cold. She might still be alive, Sandra said, but I can't find any recent records, no property ownership, no tax filings. She either left the country or she's dead too, Henry finished quietly. Sandra printed out everything she'd found and handed the stack of papers to Henry. What's this about? She asked gently. Why are you researching Walter Brennan? Henry and Martha exchanged looks. They'd agreed not to tell anyone, not yet, but Sandra was kind and trustworthy, and they needed guidance. We're living in his old greenhouse, Henry admitted, the one on the abandoned farm. Our home was destroyed in the storm and we had nowhere else to go. Sandra's eyes filled with sympathy. Oh, Henry, I'm so sorry. That property's been abandoned for decades. I don't think anyone would care if you stayed there temporarily. That's not all, Martha added quietly. We found something in the greenhouse, something Walter left behind. What kind of something? Henry hesitated, then said simply, We think it might be valuable. We need to know if he had heirs before we do anything. Sandra looked at them for a long moment, understanding dawning in her eyes. You found something on his property, and you're trying to do the right thing. We're trying to understand what the right thing is, Henry corrected. Sandra nodded slowly. Based on what I'm seeing here, Walter Brennan died intestate. No will. His estate went through probate, but there wasn't much. The farm was foreclosed on for back taxes in '85. It's been sold and resold several times since then. Currently, it's owned by, she checked her computer, a bank in Kansas City. They've been trying to sell it for years, but no one wants it. So no heirs, Martha said. Not that I can find. Caroline Peters is the only possibility, and she disappeared from public records over 40 years ago. She'd be in her 70s now if she's still alive. Sandra leaned forward. Whatever you found, if it was hidden on that property and Walter had no heirs, there might be a legal argument that you have rights to it. But you'd need a lawyer, a good one. They walked back to the greenhouse in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun was setting by the time they arrived, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The greenhouse glowed in the fading light, looking almost beautiful, almost like home. But as they approached, they realized they weren't alone. A truck was parked near the entrance, a newer model, clean and well-maintained, so out of place in the abandoned landscape it might as well have been a spaceship. And standing by the greenhouse door was a man in his 40s, wearing work clothes and a baseball cap, peering through the translucent panels. Henry and Martha froze. They'd been discovered. After days of solitude, someone had finally noticed them living there. The man turned at the sound of their footsteps. He had a weathered face, kind eyes, and the build of someone who worked with his hands. "Hello?" he called out. "Sorry, I didn't mean to snoop. I'm Jake Holloway. I farm the land about 2 miles east of here." Henry stepped forward cautiously. "Can we help you?" "Well, I was going to ask you the same thing." Jake gestured to the greenhouse. "I've been watching this property for years, making sure teenagers don't trash it or set it on fire. When I drove by this morning and saw smoke from a fire pit, I got curious. Didn't realize anyone was living here." "We are," Martha said, lifting her chin despite her fear. Our home was destroyed in the storm. We had nowhere else to go. Jake's expression softened. I heard about the tornado on County Road 12. That your place? Henry nodded. Mobile home, 50 years old. Didn't stand a chance. I'm sorry. Jake looked at the greenhouse, then back at them. Listen, I don't want to cause trouble. The bank that owns this place, they don't care about it. They've been trying to dump it for a decade. Far as I'm concerned, if you need shelter, this is as good a place as any. He paused. But winter's coming eventually. This greenhouse won't keep you warm when it's 20 below. We're working on it, Henry said, though he had no idea what they were working on or how. Jake studied them for a moment, seeming to make a decision. You folks need anything? I've got spare tarps, some lumber, couple of space heaters you could borrow. Martha's eyes filled with tears. That's very kind, but we can't. Sure you can, Jake interrupted gently. That's what neighbors do. I'll bring some things by tomorrow. He started to walk toward his truck, then stopped and turned back. You know, my grandfather used to talk about this place. Said a man named Walter lived here, kept to himself, was a little, he tapped his temple, you know, paranoid. Grandpa always wondered what happened to him. Henry's heart began to race. Did your grandfather know him well? Not really. No one did. Walter didn't let people get close, but Grandpa said he was brilliant once, before the fear ate him up. Jake shook his head sadly. Terrible thing living in fear. Doesn't matter how much money you have if you're too scared to live. After Jake left, Henry and Martha stood in the growing darkness, watching his taillights disappear down the dirt road. The irony of his words hung heavy in the air. Walter Brennan had died with millions hidden beneath his feet, and no one to share them with. He'd been so afraid of losing everything that he'd lost the only things that mattered: connection, trust, love. We can't be like him, Martha said quietly. Whatever we do with what we found, we can't let it make us like him. Henry took her hand. No, we won't. That night, they descended into the cellar one more time. They brought the journal, and by lamplight, Henry read the entries again, hearing the progression of a man being consumed by his own fear. Walter had started out wanting to protect what he'd built, but somewhere along the way, protection had turned into isolation. The fortune he'd hidden was supposed to be insurance against catastrophe, but it had become a prison instead. He wrote that he hoped someone who needed it would find it, Martha said. Someone who would use it better than he did. We need it, Henry acknowledged. God knows we need it. But what does better mean? What did he want? Martha picked up the journal and turned to the last page, reading the final entry again. Use it wisely. Use it better than I did. Don't let fear steal your life the way it stole mine. She looked up at Henry, her eyes bright in the lamplight. I think he wanted it to bring life, not fear. To connect people, not isolate them. Henry nodded slowly. Then that's what we'll do. If it's ours to keep, if we have legal right to it, we'll use it the way he should have. We'll build something that matters. But first, they needed to navigate the legal maze ahead of them. They needed to understand their rights, file the proper claims, protect themselves from anyone who might try to take what they'd found. They needed help, and they had no idea where to find it. The answer came the next morning, when Jake returned as promised with supplies, and brought someone with him, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. This is my sister-in-law, Rachel Simmons, Jake said. She's a lawyer in Kansas City, does a lot of pro bono work. I told her about your situation and she wanted to meet you. Rachel smiled warmly. Jake mentioned you lost your home and you're trying to get back on your feet. I'd like to help if I can. I specialize in property law and estate issues. She paused, her intelligent eyes studying them carefully. And Jake also mentioned you found something on this property. Something that's complicating things. Henry and Martha looked at each other. This was the moment. They could keep the secret, or they could trust someone. They could hide like Walter had, or they could take a different path. "We did," Henry said finally, "and we need help figuring out what to do with it." Rachel's expression didn't change. "Why don't you show me?" They led her to the greenhouse, pulled back the trapdoor, and descended into the cellar. When Rachel saw what was there, she went very still. She walked slowly through the space, examining items without touching them, her lawyer's mind clearly working through possibilities and implications. After 10 minutes, she came back up the stairs, her expression unreadable. "Okay," she said calmly, though her eyes betrayed her shock. "First question. Have you taken anything from down there?" "No," Henry said. "We've examined it, made notes, but we haven't removed anything." "Good. Second question. Do you understand what this is?" "A fortune," Martha said quietly. "Maybe millions of dollars." "At least," Rachel confirmed. "Those gold coins alone could be worth tens of millions at today's prices. Add in everything else." She shook her head. "This is one of the most significant treasure finds I've ever heard of, and legally it's complicated." "We want to do the right thing," Henry said. "That's why we were researching Walter Brennan. We need to know if he has heirs." Rachel smiled. "The fact that your first instinct was to look for heirs tells me everything I need to know about your character. Most people would have taken the money and run." She pulled out a business card. "Here's what I propose. Let me do a thorough investigation into Walter Brennan's estate, his potential heirs, and the legal status of this property. If there are no legitimate heirs and you followed proper procedures for finding hidden property, you may have a valid claim under Kansas treasure trove law. But this needs to be done carefully, legally, and transparently. Can you trust me to handle this?" Martha looked at Henry. 52 years of marriage had taught them to communicate without words. In his eyes, she saw the same thing she felt: hope, fear, and the desperate need to believe that good things could still happen to good people. "Yes," Henry said. "We trust you." And with that decision, they stepped fully into the light, choosing transparency over secrecy, hope over fear, and the possibility of a future they'd never dared to imagine. Rachel Simmons didn't waste time. Within 3 days of her first visit to the greenhouse, she'd assembled a small team: a forensic accountant, a historical researcher, and a specialist in estate law. They descended on the cellar like archaeologists, photographing everything, cataloging items, cross-referencing serial numbers on bills and markings on gold bars against historical databases. Henry and Martha watched nervously from above, uncertain whether they'd made the right choice by involving others, but knowing they'd never be able to navigate this maze alone. On the 4th day, Rachel returned to the greenhouse with a thick folder and an expression that was equal parts amazement and concern. She sat with Martha and Henry on the wooden benches, the autumn sun filtering through the greenhouse panels, casting long shadows across the dirt floor. "I need to tell you about Walter Brennan," she began, opening the folder, "because his story is extraordinary, tragic, and directly connected to what you found." She pulled out a photograph, black and white, edges worn, showing a young man in an army uniform. He had sharp eyes, a strong jaw, and the kind of face that suggested intelligence and determination. This was Walter in 1943, age 29. He'd already served in North Africa, was about to ship out to Italy. By all accounts, he was a hero. Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. He came home in 1946 with medals and nightmares. Martha leaned closer, studying the face. It was hard to reconcile this young soldier with the paranoid recluse who'd died alone. "He married Eleanor Dawson in 1947, Rachel continued, laying out more photographs. A wedding picture showed Walter and a beautiful woman with dark hair and a gentle smile. By all accounts, they were happy. Walter worked as an accountant, but he had a gift. He could see patterns in financial data that other people missed. He started investing in the stock market in the early 50s, and everything he touched turned to gold. She spread out documents, stock certificates, bank statements, property deeds. By 1960, he was a millionaire. By 1968, he'd multiplied that several times over. He bought this farm as a retreat, built the greenhouse himself. Eleanor loved it here. She wanted to start over, get away from the city, live simply. "What happened?" Henry asked quietly. Rachel's expression grew somber. Eleanor was diagnosed with cancer in 1970. She fought for 2 years, but it was aggressive. She died in April of 1972. She pulled out a newspaper clipping, an obituary. After that, something in Walter broke. She laid out more documents, these ones darker in tone. Letters from Walter's children, Daniel and Caroline, expressing concern about their father's mental state. Reports from doctors who'd evaluated him at his children's request. Notes from friends who'd tried to reach out, only to be rebuffed. He became convinced the economy was going to collapse, Rachel explained. And to be fair, the early 70s were economically turbulent. Inflation was high, the stock market was volatile. There was the oil crisis, Nixon closing the gold window. For someone who'd lived through the Depression as a child, who'd seen his own father lose everything, these warning signs triggered something deep. She pulled out Walter's journal, the one Martha and Henry had found, and opened it to entries she'd marked. May 3rd, 1973. I can see it coming. The same pattern my father saw in 29. Everyone says it's different this time, that the government has safeguards now, but paper promises backed by paper money printed by scared politicians. It's all just paper, and paper burns. Henry listened, his throat tight. He understood that fear. He'd lived with it his entire life, the terror that everything could disappear, that one bad break could destroy you. For Walter, that fear had become all-consuming. He started liquidating everything, Rachel continued, sold his stocks, his bonds, his real estate holdings. By 1975, he'd converted everything to physical assets, gold, coins, jewelry, anything that couldn't become worthless if the banks failed. He created this collection over 2 years, methodically, obsessively, and he hid it here, in the cellar he'd built beneath the greenhouse. Why didn't he tell anyone? Martha asked. His children, at least? Rachel pulled out letters, handwritten, desperate. His children tried. They wanted to help. But Walter had convinced himself that everyone, including them, was after his money. Look at this. She unfolded a letter dated December 1975 from Daniel Brennan. Dad, please let us help you. We're not trying to take anything from you. We're worried about you. Mom wouldn't want you living like this, alone and afraid. The money doesn't matter. You matter. Please call me, please. The letter had never been answered. He pushed everyone away, Rachel said quietly. And he died alone, 8 years after hiding all this, never having touched a penny of it. The irony is devastating. He spent his whole life afraid of poverty, accumulated massive wealth, then died in poverty anyway because he was too paranoid to use what he had. Henry stood and walked to the window, his back to them. Martha could see his shoulders shaking slightly. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. We could have been him. If we'd found this and let fear control us, we could have become exactly like him. But you didn't, Rachel said firmly. Your first instinct was to find his heirs. That tells me you understand something Walter forgot, that wealth without purpose is just a different kind of poverty. She pulled out more documents, these ones more recent. I tracked down Caroline Peters, Walter's daughter. She's alive, living in Oregon under her married name. She's 76 years old, married, 3 children, 7 grandchildren. I contacted her through her lawyer. Martha's heart sank. So she has a claim to everything. I thought so too, Rachel said. But here's where it gets interesting. She pulled out a legal document. When Walter died, his estate went through probate. It was valued at approximately $87,000, just the farmhouse and some personal effects. The farm was foreclosed for back taxes in 1985. Both Caroline and Daniel were contacted during probate. They both signed documents renouncing any claim to their father's estate. They wanted nothing to do with it. Why? Henry asked. Because he'd hurt them too badly. The money, the paranoia, the accusations, it had poisoned everything. They wanted to be done with him, done with the pain, so they walked away. She tapped the document. Legally, they gave up any rights to anything connected to Walter Brennan's estate. But they didn't know about the cellar, Martha said. About what was hidden. No, Rachel agreed. And that's the complication. If they'd known, would they have renounced their claim? Probably not. But they signed legal documents, notarized and witnessed, saying they wanted nothing from their father's estate. Period. She pulled out another set of papers. I spoke with Caroline, told her we'd discovered something on her father's old property and wanted to inform her before proceeding. You know what she said? Martha and Henry waited, barely breathing. She said, whatever he left behind, I don't want it. That money killed my mother. The stress of it, the fear of losing it. Then it killed my father, just more slowly. If you found something, keep it. Use it. Do something good with it. Don't let it destroy you like it destroyed him. Rachel's eyes were bright with emotion. She meant it. Her lawyer drafted a formal statement renouncing any claim to anything discovered on the property. She wants nothing to do with it. The silence in the greenhouse was profound. Outside, birds sang in the autumn trees. A truck passed on the distant highway. Life continued while Martha and Henry sat with the weight of what they'd just learned. So it's ours, Henry finally whispered. Not quite that simple, Rachel said. We still need to establish legal ownership. The property belongs to a bank in Kansas City. They foreclosed on it decades ago. We need to file a treasure trove claim with the state, which will trigger an investigation. There will be hearings, appraisals, legal challenges. But based on Kansas law, the fact that the original owner is deceased, the heirs have renounced claim, and you discovered it while legally occupying the property. Yes, I believe you have a strong case for ownership. How long? Martha asked. 6 months to a year, maybe longer, and during that time this will become public knowledge. There's no way to keep something like this secret once we file the legal paperwork. Rachel was right. Within 2 weeks of filing the treasure trove claim, the story leaked. It started small. A mention in the local newspaper, elderly couple discovers historic collection on abandoned property. But by the third day, it had gone regional. By the first week, national news outlets had picked it up. Homeless couple finds $200 million fortune in Kansas greenhouse. The number came from the preliminary appraisal Rachel's team had conducted. $230 million to be precise. The gold alone was worth over $100 million at current prices. The coins, some of them were so rare that individual pieces were valued in the millions. The jewelry, the documents, the stock certificates that might still have value, all of it added up to a fortune that seemed impossible, fantastical, like something from a movie. And with the publicity came the people. The first visitors were benign, curiosity seekers who drove out to see the greenhouse, take pictures, maybe catch a glimpse of Martha and Henry. Jake Holloway, true to his word, helped them install better locks and put up no trespassing signs. The sheriff, a man named Tom Mullins, who'd known Henry for 30 years, started doing regular patrols. But then came the others. It started with a phone call to the church. Father Tom fielded it and immediately told Rachel. A man claiming to be Walter Brennan's nephew, demanding his rightful inheritance. Rachel investigated and found the man had no connection to the Brennan family whatsoever, just an opportunist hoping to cash in. Then came the letters. Dozens of them, forwarded through Rachel's office. Some were desperate, people in genuine need asking for help. Others were threatening, anonymous notes warning that accidents happen and old people should be careful. One letter, written in block capitals, simply said, "That money isn't yours. Give it back or else." Henry found that one particularly chilling because give it back to whom? Walter was dead. His heirs didn't want it. Who exactly were they supposed to return it to? The worst incident came on a cold October night, 3 weeks after the story broke. Martha and Henry were asleep in the greenhouse. They'd set up a more comfortable sleeping area with donations from the church, including a real mattress and a space heater, when they heard the sound of breaking glass. Henry jerked awake, his heart hammering. Someone was trying to break in through one of the greenhouse panels. He grabbed the baseball bat Jake had given him and moved toward the door, Martha right behind him with the phone Jake had also provided, already dialing 911. "Get away from here!" Henry shouted, trying to sound braver than he felt. "The sheriff's been called!" A voice came back, young and male, slurred with alcohol or drugs. "You don't deserve that money, old man. You just got lucky. Share it or we'll take it." "There's nothing here," Henry yelled. "Everything's been removed. You're risking prison for nothing." It was true. Rachel had arranged for everything in the cellar to be moved to a secure facility in Kansas City pending the legal proceedings. The greenhouse held only their few belongings now. More sounds of breaking glass. Then suddenly, sirens in the distance, getting closer. The would-be thieves scattered, running into the darkness. Sheriff Mullins arrived 5 minutes later with 2 deputies, but the intruders were gone, leaving only broken panels and Martha shaking uncontrollably in Henry's arms. "That's it," Sheriff Mullins said firmly. "You two can't stay here anymore. It's not safe." "We have nowhere else to go," Martha said, her voice small. "Yes, you do." The voice came from behind them. They turned to see Jake Holloway, who must have heard the sirens and driven over. "You're staying with us. Sarah and I have a guest room. It's yours as long as you need it." "We can't," Henry started. "You can and you will," Jake said firmly. "Look, I know about pride. I know about not wanting charity. But this isn't charity. This is neighbors taking care of neighbors. And right now, you need taking care of." So Martha and Henry moved into Jake and Sarah Holloway's farmhouse, into a room with clean sheets and a warm quilt, with locks on the doors and people who cared about their safety. It was the first time in months they'd felt truly secure, and the relief of it made Martha cry for an hour straight. But the incident changed something. Word spread through Millbrook about the break-in, about the threats, about these 2 elderly people who'd lost everything and then found something impossible, only to have it put them in danger. The community's response surprised everyone. It started with Gladys Peterson, who owned the diner on Main Street. She posted a sign in her window. "Martha and Henry Caldwell are part of our community. Anyone threatening them is not welcome here." Other businesses followed suit: the grocery store, the hardware store, the gas station. Then Father Tom organized a town meeting at the church. Over 200 people showed up, packing the small building until people were standing in the aisles and spilling out onto the lawn. "We're here to talk about our neighbors," Father Tom began. "Martha and Henry Caldwell have lived in this community for over 40 years. They've worked hard, raised their family here, and asked for nothing. When tragedy struck, they survived with dignity. Now they've discovered something that could change their lives, and instead of celebration, they're facing threats and danger." He paused, his voice growing stronger. "That's not who we are. That's not what this community stands for." An older woman in the front row stood up. "I remember when Martha brought soup to my house every day for a month after my surgery. Wouldn't take a penny. Said that's what neighbors do." Another voice. "Henry fixed my car for free when I couldn't afford repairs. Got me to work for 6 more months until I could save up for a new one." More stories emerged, one after another. Small kindnesses, quiet generosities, the accumulated evidence of 2 lives lived with decency and grace. Martha and Henry, sitting in the back, had no idea so many people remembered these things, had no idea they'd touched so many lives. Jake stood up. "The way I see it, Martha and Henry finding that fortune isn't just luck. It's justice. They've given to this community their whole lives. Now life's giving something back. and anyone who threatens them threatens all of us." The room erupted in applause. People stood, nodding, voicing agreement. And in that moment, something shifted. Martha and Henry weren't alone anymore. They had an entire town standing behind them. But support from the community couldn't solve the legal complications that kept mounting. A week after the town meeting, Rachel called with troubling news. The bank that owns the property is filing a counterclaim. They're arguing that anything found on their property belongs to them. "Can they do that?" Henry asked, his heart sinking. "They can try, and technically they have a point. The property is theirs, but we have precedent on our side. Kansas treasure trove law clearly states that hidden property discovered by occupants has value beyond real estate claims. We'll fight it, but it complicates things." Then came another complication, the IRS. They wanted their share naturally. Even if Martha and Henry won full legal ownership, they'd owe substantial taxes on the value of what they'd found. Rachel estimated 40% of the total value, maybe more. "That's still over $130 million, Rachel pointed out. "You'd be among the wealthiest people in Kansas." But Martha didn't care about being wealthy. She cared about being safe, being secure, being able to help her family and her community. The number was so large it had lost meaning. The pressure was building. Every day brought new challenges, new threats, new complications. Henry's health was suffering. His blood pressure was dangerously high, and he'd developed a tremor in his hands. Martha couldn't sleep, jumping at every sound, terrified someone would break in and hurt them despite being in Jake's secure house. One night, lying in the guest room, Martha whispered, "Henry, I'm scared." "Me too." "What if this destroys us? What if we become like Walter, so consumed by the money that we lose ourselves?" Henry was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We need to decide what this is for. Right now, it's just this huge, terrifying thing hanging over us. But if we give it purpose, if we decide how we want to use it, maybe it becomes less scary." "What do you mean?" "I mean, let's decide now before any court says it's ours, before we touch a penny of it. Let's decide what we're going to do with it. Make a plan, a promise to each other and to Walter's memory." Martha turned to face him in the darkness. "You mean like a legacy?" "Exactly like that." So they began to plan. Lying in that guest room, they talked about everything they'd suffered through, every struggle, every family that had helped them, every person in Millbrook who'd shown them kindness. They talked about what Walter had written in his journal. "Use it wisely. Use it better than I did. Don't let fear steal your life." "We could help people," Martha said. "People like us. People who work hard but can never get ahead, who live one emergency away from losing everything." "A foundation," Henry said. "Something permanent that keeps giving even after we're gone." "Medical debt," Martha added, thinking of the bills that had nearly destroyed them over the years. "We could help families drowning in medical bills." "Housing, education, food security." They talked for hours, planning not what they'd buy for themselves but what they'd build for others. And in the planning, the fear began to loosen its grip. The fortune stopped being a terrifying burden and became a tool, a means to an end, a way to honor Walter's wasted life by living theirs differently. By morning, they'd made their decision. 2 days later, Rachel called another meeting. This time, she brought the forensic accountant and the estate lawyer. They sat in Jake's living room, papers spread across the coffee table. "The hearing is scheduled for January 15th, Rachel began. 3 months from now. The judge will hear arguments from us, from the bank, from the IRS, from anyone else who files a claim. Based on the evidence, I believe we'll win, but there are no guarantees." "We've made a decision," Henry said. "Regardless of what the court decides, if we're awarded ownership, we're giving away most of it." Rachel blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" Martha leaned forward. "We want to establish a foundation. The Brennan Caldwell Foundation, named after Walter and us, dedicated to helping people in poverty, especially the elderly. medical debt relief, housing assistance, food security, education. We'll keep enough to be comfortable, to take care of our children and grandchildren. But the rest, the vast majority, goes to the foundation. The lawyers exchanged glances. That's very generous, the accountant said carefully. But you're talking about potentially giving away over $150 million. I know, Henry said. And we've thought about it, really thought about it. This money almost destroyed Walter because he held it too tight. We're not going to make that mistake. Rachel studied them for a long moment. Then she smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. Walter would have been proud. Hell, I'm proud. Okay, if that's what you want, we'll make it happen. Win or lose, we'll have a plan in place. The months leading up to the hearing were strange. The story had gone national, then international. Martha and Henry received interview requests from major news outlets, offers for book deals, even a movie producer who wanted to buy their life rights. Rachel fielded all of it, turning most requests down, but accepting a few that she felt would help their case. Local news, sympathetic human interest pieces, stories that emphasized their character rather than the fortune. The town of Millbrook rallied around them. The mayor issued a proclamation declaring them honorary citizens of the year. The high school invited them to speak at an assembly about perseverance and integrity. Children drew pictures of them, depicting them as heroes finding treasure like pirates, though the reality had been far less glamorous. But with fame came increased danger. 2 more attempted break-ins at the greenhouse, even though everyone knew it was empty. Threatening letters continued to arrive. The sheriff had to station a deputy near Jake's house after someone called in a threat. Through it all, Martha and Henry held on to their plan. They met with foundation experts, learning how to structure their giving to have maximum impact. They talked to people who ran similar organizations, asking advice. They began to envision the legacy they wanted to leave, not of wealth but of compassion. One evening in early December, Caroline Peters called. Rachel had given her Martha and Henry's number, and Caroline had finally worked up the courage to reach out. "I wanted to thank you," Caroline said, her voice shaking slightly, "for honoring my father's memory better than I ever could." "We're trying," Martha said gently. "I read about your foundation plans, about using the money to help people. That's what he should have done. What he wanted to do, I think, before the fear took over." She paused. "He wasn't always like that, you know. When my mother was alive, he was kind, generous. He'd give money to anyone who needed it. But after she died, something in him broke. He couldn't see past his own fear anymore." "We're sorry for your loss," Henry said, listening on the extension. "Both your losses, your mother and the father he used to be." "Thank you," Caroline whispered. "Use it well. Build something beautiful. Give him the ending his story deserves." When they hung up, Martha and Henry sat in silence, the weight of responsibility settling over them like a blanket. They weren't just managing a fortune anymore. They were honoring a life, completing a story that had been left unfinished, turning tragedy into hope. "Are we doing the right thing?" Martha asked quietly. "Giving so much away?" Henry took her hand, the same hand he'd held for 52 years. "I think we're doing the only thing. The money doesn't belong to us, not really. It belongs to everyone who needs it. We're just stewards, caretakers, passing it along to where it can do the most good." "What if we fail? What if the foundation doesn't work, or the money gets wasted, or—" "Then we fail having tried," Henry interrupted. "We fail having bet on hope instead of fear. That's still better than what Walter did, dying with millions hidden in the ground, having helped no one, having lived for nothing but his own terror." Martha nodded slowly. He was right. Whatever came next, court battles, public scrutiny, the enormous responsibility of managing a fortune and giving it away, They would face it together, guided not by fear, but by purpose. And that made all the difference. January 15th arrived cold and gray, the kind of Kansas winter morning that made your bones ache just looking at it. Martha and Henry stood outside the courthouse in Topeka, bundled in donated coats that were warmer than anything they'd owned in years, watching their breath turn to mist in the frozen air. Behind them, 3 buses had arrived from Millbrook. Over 150 people had made the 3-hour journey to support them. The sight of it made Martha's throat close with emotion. "I never knew this many people cared," she whispered to Henry. He squeezed her hand. "They always did. We just never let ourselves see it." Inside, the courtroom was packed. Rachel had warned them it would be a circus, and she was right. Lawyers representing the bank sat on one side, their suits expensive and their expressions confident. The IRS had their own representation. 3 separate individuals had filed last-minute claims, each arguing they deserved a portion of the fortune. Distant cousins of Walter's, supposedly, though Rachel's research had proven them all frauds. Judge Patricia Morrison entered, and everyone stood. She was a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that suggested she'd seen every trick lawyers could pull and wasn't impressed by any of them. She'd built her reputation on fairness and no-nonsense pragmatism. Martha allowed herself a small hope that this might work in their favor. "This is a treasure trove case," Judge Morrison began once everyone was seated. "One of the most significant in Kansas history. We're here to determine rightful ownership of property discovered by Martha and Henry Caldwell on land currently owned by First Kansas Credit Union, property that originally belonged to Walter Brennan, deceased. We'll hear arguments from all parties, then I'll make my determination based on Kansas law and precedent." The bank's lawyer went first. He was young, polished, and spoke with the kind of confidence that came from never having worried about money. "Your Honor, the law is clear. The property belongs to First Kansas Credit Union. We acquired it through legal foreclosure in 1985. Anything on that property above or below ground is ours by right of ownership. The Caldwells were trespassing." "They were seeking shelter after losing their home in a natural disaster," Rachel interrupted, standing. "They weren't trespassing with intent to commit crime. They were surviving." Judge Morrison held up a hand. "You'll get your turn, Counselor Simmons. Continue, Mr. Baxter." The bank's lawyer outlined their case: property rights, clear title, precedent from similar cases. It was compelling, Martha had to admit, built on solid legal ground. If the law was only about ownership of land, the bank would win easily. Then Rachel stood for their defense. She approached the bench with a thick folder, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Your Honor, this case isn't just about property law. It's about treasure trove doctrine, which Kansas recognizes. The doctrine states that hidden property, concealed by a previous owner and discovered by someone legally occupying the land, belongs to the finder, not the landowner. The key word is hidden. Walter Brennan deliberately concealed this collection. The bank never knew it existed. When they foreclosed, they acquired the surface property, but not what was intentionally hidden beneath it." She pulled out documents. "I have here the property surveys from the foreclosure. No mention of a root cellar, no indication of any underground structure. The bank's own appraisal valued the property at $8,000, just the land and the greenhouse structure. They never investigated further because they had no reason to. They didn't lose anything they knew they had. They're claiming something they never possessed." The bank's lawyer objected, but Judge Morrison silenced him with a look. "Continue, Counselor Simmons." "Furthermore, I have documentation showing Walter Brennan's intent." She presented Walter's journal, the passages marked where he'd written about hiding the collection, about hoping someone who needed it would find it. Walter Brennan deliberately concealed this property with the explicit hope that a future finder would discover and use it. His surviving daughter, Caroline Peters, has provided sworn testimony renouncing any claim and expressing her wish that the Caldwells keep what they found. Rachel walked to where Martha and Henry sat. These aren't treasure hunters. They're not opportunists. They're two people who've worked hard their entire lives, who lost everything in a storm, and who discovered something extraordinary while simply trying to survive. Their first action wasn't to hide the treasure or spend it. It was to research the original owner, to find his heirs, to try to do the right thing. She pulled out more documents, the library records showing their research, Father Tom's statement about their character, letters from community members. They've already pledged to give away the majority of what they might be awarded. They're establishing the Brennan Caldwell Foundation to help people in poverty. They're not keeping this fortune for themselves. They're turning it into a legacy that honors both Walter Brennan's lost potential and their own lifetime of service. The courtroom was silent. Even the bank's lawyers looked uncomfortable. Judge Morrison reviewed the documents for what felt like hours. Finally, she looked up. "I'm going to recess for 2 hours to review all materials and precedents. We'll reconvene at 2 p.m. for my decision." The wait was agonizing. Martha and Henry sat in a small conference room with Rachel, unable to eat the sandwiches Jake's wife Sarah had packed, unable to do anything but wait and worry. Outside, the Millbrook contingent had taken over a nearby diner, their presence drawing curious looks from locals who couldn't understand why a small town had sent buses to a court hearing. "However this goes," Rachel said quietly, "you've already won something important. You've shown who you are. That matters." "But will it matter to the judge?" Martha asked, her voice small. "We'll know soon." At 2 p.m. exactly, they filed back into the courtroom. Judge Morrison entered, her expression unreadable. Martha felt Henry's hand trembling in hers, or maybe it was her own hand trembling. After 52 years, it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. "I've reviewed all evidence, statements, and precedents," Judge Morrison began. "This is a complex case that involves property law, treasure trove doctrine, estate law, and questions of moral equity. I'm going to address each party's claims in turn." She looked at the bank's lawyers. First Kansas Credit Union has legal ownership of the surface property. However, their claim that all discovered items belong to them is not supported by Kansas treasure trove precedent. The collection was deliberately hidden by a previous owner with no notation in any property records. The bank acquired land, not hidden treasure they never knew existed. Their claim is denied. Martha gasped. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked like thunder. "The 3 individuals claiming kinship to Walter Brennan have provided insufficient evidence of relationship. DNA tests requested by Counselor Simmons show no genetic connection to Walter Brennan's known relatives. These claims are denied as fraudulent." More whispers. Rachel allowed herself a small smile. As for the Caldwells, Judge Morrison's gaze settled on Martha and Henry, and for the first time her stern expression softened slightly. "You discovered hidden property while legally occupying the land. Seeking shelter is not trespassing when done out of necessity during a natural disaster. You took immediate steps to identify the rightful owner and heirs. You've demonstrated extraordinary character in handling this discovery." Martha couldn't breathe. This was it. "However, the IRS has a valid claim for taxes on any awarded property. After consultation with tax law experts, I'm ruling that 42% of the appraised value must go to federal and state taxes." Martha's heart sank. 42% of $230 million was, she couldn't do the math, her mind was spinning. "That leaves $133,400,000, Judge Morrison continued. "Of that amount, I'm awarding 10% to First Kansas Credit Union as compensation for the use of their property during the discovery and storage period." Another $13 million gone. Martha felt dizzy. The remaining $120,060,000 I am awarding in full to Martha and Henry Caldwell under Kansas Treasure Trove law, with the condition that they establish the proposed Brennan Caldwell Foundation within 6 months and transfer no less than 60% of the award to said foundation for charitable purposes. The courtroom exploded. People from Millbrook were on their feet, cheering. The bank's lawyers were gathering their papers, looking frustrated but resigned. Rachel was hugging Martha, who was crying so hard she couldn't see. $120 million. Even after giving 60% to the foundation, they'd have nearly $48 million left. $48 million for 2 people who'd been living on dirt floors 3 months ago. Judge Morrison's gavel rang out again. "Order! I'm not finished." The room quieted. "I want to say something off the record, though it will be part of the court transcript." She looked directly at Martha and Henry. "In 30 years on the bench, I've seen a lot of people fighting over money. I've seen families destroyed, friendships ruined, lives consumed by greed. What I haven't seen often enough is what you two have shown: integrity, compassion, and the wisdom to understand that wealth is a responsibility, not just a windfall." Her voice grew stronger. "Walter Brennan died alone, his fortune having bought him nothing but fear and isolation. You have the chance to give his story a different ending. Use this money wisely. Honor his memory by living fully, by connecting with others, by building something that lasts. Make this fortune mean something." Martha was sobbing now, Henry's arm around her, and she heard him say in a choked voice, "We will, Your Honor. We promise we will." What happens next will turn this discovery upside down, reveal a truth about Walter Brennan nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the smallest acts of survival can lead to the biggest transformations. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The months that followed the court decision were a whirlwind that left Martha and Henry exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. The first thing they did, even before the money was officially transferred, was work with Rachel to establish the Brennan Caldwell Foundation. They brought in experts, people who'd run successful charitable organizations, and they listened. They learned about sustainable giving, about how to structure programs for maximum impact, about the difference between charity that created dependency and support that built independence. They rented a small office in Millbrook, just 3 rooms above the hardware store on Main Street, and hired a director, a woman named Patricia Vance, who'd spent 20 years running humanitarian programs for international nonprofits. Patricia was no-nonsense, brilliant, and shared their vision completely. "We're not here to be saviors," Patricia told them in their first meeting. "We're here to be partners, to give people the tools and support they need to save themselves." The foundation's mission was simple but profound: to help people in poverty, especially the elderly, access basic needs, medical care, housing, food, education, with dignity and respect. No forms designed to humiliate, no hoops to jump through. Just human beings helping human beings. Their first program launched in April, just 3 months after the court decision: medical debt relief. They identified families in Kansas drowning in medical bills and paid off their debts completely. No strings attached, no publicity unless the families wanted it, just relief. The first family they helped was the Johnsons, David, his wife Maria, and their 3 kids. David had been diagnosed with cancer 2 years earlier. He'd survived, but the bills had destroyed them. They were 3 months from losing their house, despite both parents working full-time. Martha and Henry drove to their home personally to deliver the news. They sat in the Johnsons' cramped living room with its worn furniture and children's drawings taped to the walls, and Martha said simply, "Your medical debt has been paid, all of it. You don't owe anything anymore." Maria broke down. David just stared, unable to process it. The oldest child, a girl of maybe 12, whispered, "Does this mean we don't have to move?" "You don't have to move," Henry confirmed, his own eyes wet. They helped 17 families that first month. The word spread and the applications poured in. Patricia and her small team worked 12-hour days reviewing cases, verifying need, processing payments. The foundation paid out $3 million in medical debt relief in its first 3 months. But Martha and Henry didn't just write checks. They showed up. They visited families, listened to stories, held crying children, sat with exhausted parents. They remembered what it felt like to be drowning, to see no way out, and they wanted people to know someone cared. One evening, after a particularly long day of home visits, Henry said to Martha, "This is what Walter's money was supposed to do all along. Not sit in a cellar growing dust. This, helping people." Martha nodded, too tired and too full of emotion to speak. Their second major initiative was housing. They'd lived in that greenhouse, slept on dirt floors, known the terror of having no shelter. They couldn't let others suffer the same. The foundation bought the old Morrison Apartments in Millbrook, a 3-story building that had been condemned for code violations. They renovated it completely, brought it up to modern standards, and converted it to affordable housing for the elderly and disabled. Rent was set on a sliding scale based on income. No one would be turned away for inability to pay. The day the Morrison Senior Housing opened, Martha and Henry stood in the lobby as residents moved in. They watched a woman in her 70s using a walker enter her new apartment and break down crying because it had a bathtub with safety bars, and she hadn't been able to bathe safely in 3 years. They watched a man in his 80s, a veteran who'd been living in his car, walk into his studio apartment and just stand there, overwhelmed. He'd slept in a bed for the first time in 2 years that night. "This is what matters," Martha whispered to Henry. "Not the money. These moments." But even as they built these programs, even as they gave away millions and saw lives transformed, Martha and Henry were processing their own transformation. They'd moved out of Jake and Sarah's house into a modest home they'd purchased. Nothing extravagant, just a comfortable 3-bedroom house on the edge of Millbrook with a porch and a small garden. After a lifetime of barely scraping by, of mobile homes and rented spaces, they owned a real house. Their children had come to visit, all 3 of them, when news of the court decision broke. The reunions had been awkward at first, weighted by years of distance and unspoken hurt. Claire, their daughter, arrived from Chicago with her family, her expression a mixture of joy and guilt. "I should have been there," she said, crying in Martha's arms. "When you lost your home, when you were living in that greenhouse, I should have known. I should have helped." "You're here now," Martha said gently. "That's what matters." Michael came from Denver, his own eyes haunted. "I sent money sometimes, but it was never enough. And it wasn't what you needed anyway. You needed me. You needed your son." "You have your own life," Henry said, though his voice shook. "We never wanted to be a burden." "You weren't a burden," Michael said fiercely. "You were our parents, and we abandoned you because it was easier than facing how much you struggled." Even Thomas, their youngest, who hadn't called in 3 years, came from Seattle. He couldn't speak at first, just held them both and cried. The family wounds didn't heal overnight. Years of distance couldn't be erased by one fortune or one reunion, but they began the work of rebuilding, of learning to be a family again. The grandchildren, who barely knew Martha and Henry, started visiting regularly. Suddenly there were Sunday dinners and holiday plans and the kind of ordinary family chaos Martha had thought she'd lost forever. One evening, sitting on their new porch with Claire, watching the sunset paint the Kansas sky in shades of orange and gold, Martha said, "I spent so many years thinking we'd failed you, failed all 3 of you. We couldn't give you the life we wanted to." Claire took her hand. "You gave us something better than money. You showed us how to survive, how to keep going when everything falls apart. I didn't appreciate it then. I was angry about being poor, about the things we couldn't have. But now, seeing how you've handled this fortune, seeing your first instinct being to give it away, I understand. You were teaching us all along that wealth isn't money, it's character." Martha cried then, releasing decades of guilt and fear and the belief that she'd somehow failed her children by being poor. As spring turned to summer, the transformation of Millbrook accelerated. The Foundation's third major initiative was the Community Resource Center, built on the site where the old grain mill had stood empty for 20 years. It housed job training programs, adult education classes, child care services, and a food bank that operated with dignity, more like a grocery store where people shopped for free than a traditional handout system. Henry spent mornings there, teaching basic carpentry and mechanical skills to young people who couldn't afford trade school. He'd gather a group of teenagers and 20-somethings around old engines and woodworking benches, showing them the skills that had kept him employed for 50 years. "The world tells you that if you work with your hands, you're somehow less," he'd say, his weathered hands guiding a young person's grip on a wrench. That's a lie. These skills built this country. They'll build your future if you let them. Martha taught financial literacy, which was almost funny, given she'd lived in poverty her entire life. But that's exactly why people listened. She didn't teach from theory. She taught from survival. "I know what it's like to choose between medicine and groceries," she'd tell her classes, mostly young mothers and elderly folks on fixed incomes. "I know what it's like to stretch $1 until it screams. So I'm not going to tell you to just spend less. I'm going to teach you how to survive a system designed to keep you poor, and then how to build something better." Her classes were always full. People related to her in ways they never could to financial advisors in suits who'd never missed a meal. The Foundation also established a scholarship program for local students, full ride to any state college plus living expenses. The first year, they awarded 23 scholarships. The second year, 41. They prioritized first-generation college students, kids from families like Martha and Henry had been, where higher education seemed impossible. At the first scholarship ceremony, a young woman named Rosa Mendez gave a speech. She was the daughter of farm workers, the first in her family born in the United States, heading to Kansas State to study agricultural engineering. "My parents have worked in fields their whole lives," Rosa said, her voice shaking with emotion. "They've broken their bodies so I could have opportunities they never had, and I thought I'd have to choose between helping them and going to college. This scholarship means I don't have to choose. It means I can build a future and still take care of the people I love. Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, you didn't just give me money, you gave me hope." Martha and Henry sat in the audience, holding hands, crying openly. This was what they'd promised Walter's memory. This was redemption for a fortune that had once bought only isolation. By the second year after the court decision, Millbrook had transformed. The main street that had been dying now thrived with new businesses, attracted by the Foundation's small business loan program. The school district had new computers and updated facilities funded by Foundation grants. The medical clinic offered free services to anyone who couldn't pay, subsidized by the Foundation. The population, which had been declining for decades as young people left for opportunities elsewhere, stabilized. Some even moved back, drawn by the changes, by the sense that something special was happening in this forgotten Kansas town. But the transformation wasn't just economic, it was cultural, spiritual. People helped each other more. The community that had rallied around Martha and Henry during their legal battle had learned something about collective action, about the power of standing together. That spirit didn't disappear when the court case ended. It grew stronger. One October evening, the town held a celebration in the new community center. Millbrook Rising, they called it. Over 500 people attended, twice the town's actual population, because people drove in from neighboring communities to see what was happening, to be part of something good. Father Tom gave a blessing. The mayor, visibly emotional, talked about the town he'd watched dying for 20 years suddenly coming back to life. Patricia presented the foundation's 2-year report. $17 million given away, 347 families directly helped, over 1,000 people impacted by programs and services. Then they asked Martha and Henry to speak. They'd been dreading this moment. Neither of them were public speakers, and the attention still made them uncomfortable. But they stood together on the small stage, Henry's arm around Martha's waist, and looked out at the faces of their community. "We're not heroes," Henry began, his voice gruff with emotion. "We're just 2 old people who got lucky. Or maybe not lucky, maybe blessed. We found something we never expected, and it could have destroyed us the way it destroyed Walter Brennan. We could have hidden it, hoarded it, let fear consume us. But we didn't," Martha continued, her voice stronger than she expected. "Because of you. Because this community taught us that wealth isn't what you have, it's what you share. You showed us that when you brought food to the greenhouse, when you offered shelter, when you stood with us in that courtroom, you reminded us that we're not alone, that none of us have to be alone." She paused, gathering herself. "There's something we haven't told many people, something about why this matters so much to us." Henry squeezed her hand, encouraging her. 40 years ago, we had a daughter before Claire," Martha said, her voice breaking. "Her name was Emily. She was born premature, needed specialized care we couldn't afford. We had no insurance, no savings, no way to pay for what she needed. We begged, we borrowed, we tried everything. But it wasn't enough. She died at 3 months old because we were poor, and poverty meant our baby girl didn't get to live." The room was silent. Many people were crying now. "We've carried that for 40 years, Martha continued. "The guilt, the rage, the belief that we'd failed her because we couldn't afford to save her. And maybe that's why this fortune found us. Not so we could be rich, but so we could save other people's Emilys. So no parent would have to watch their child die because they couldn't pay. So no one would have to choose between medicine and food, between shelter and dignity." Henry's voice was thick with tears as he added, "Emily would be 43 now if she'd lived. We think about her every day, and every family we help, every child who gets medical care because of the foundation, every person who doesn't have to suffer the way we suffered. That's for her. That's her legacy." There wasn't a dry eye in the building. People stood, applauding through tears, and the sound was less like celebration and more like a collective release of grief and hope mixed together. After the ceremony, dozens of people approached them with their own stories of loss, of struggle, of barely surviving. Stories they'd never shared because poverty carries shame, because our society treats financial struggle as a personal failure rather than a systemic issue. But Martha and Henry listened to every story, held every person who needed holding, and understood that this was their true purpose. Not the money itself, but creating space for people to be seen, to be heard, to be valued, regardless of their bank balance. 5 years after finding the treasure, Martha and Henry Caldwell sat on their porch in the early morning light, coffee mugs warming their hands. Martha was 78 now, Henry 81. Their hair was whiter, their movements slower, but their eyes held a light that hadn't been there before, the light of purpose fulfilled, of lives lived fully. The foundation had grown beyond anything they'd imagined. It now operated in 3 states, had a full-time staff of 47, and had given away over $60 million. But more than the numbers, there were the lives, the families housed, the debts erased, the students educated, the elderly cared for with dignity. Their own children had become involved. Claire served on the foundation board, bringing her business expertise to help it run efficiently. Michael had quit his corporate job to work full-time as the foundation's operations director. Thomas ran the scholarship program, personally mentoring students who reminded him of the scared kid he'd been, escaping his family's poverty through education and distance. The grandchildren came every summer, spending weeks in Millbrook, learning about service and community. The oldest, Claire's daughter Emma, had just started college with plans to study social work. "I want to do what you do, Grandma," she'd said. "Help people the way you've helped so many." "We didn't do it alone," Martha had replied. "We did it with everyone. That's the secret. You can't help people by yourself. You have to build community." Now, watching the sunrise paint the sky, Martha thought about how far they'd come. 5 years ago, they'd been living on a dirt floor, terrified and alone. Now they were surrounded by family, by community, by purpose. "Do you think Walter would be proud?" she asked Henry. Henry was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think he'd be grateful. We gave his fortune the ending his life didn't get. We turned his fear into hope." "We kept our promise," Martha said. "We did." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from 57 years of marriage, of surviving everything together. In the distance, they could see the Morrison Senior Housing, lights beginning to come on as residents woke to a new day. Beyond that, the Community Resource Center, where later that morning Henry would teach carpentry to a new group of students. And somewhere in there, buried in paperwork and program reports and impact assessments, were thousands of lives touched, changed, saved. The greenhouse still stood on the edge of town. They'd preserved it as a museum, telling Walter's story and their own. School groups toured it regularly, learning about treasure and fear and the choice between hoarding and sharing. The root cellar beneath remained empty now, its treasures transformed into something that couldn't be locked away or hidden. Hope, opportunity, connection. Martha's phone buzzed. A text from Patricia at the foundation. "Morning! New family needs emergency housing. Mother with 3 kids, domestic violence situation. Can we fast-track approval?" Martha typed back, "Absolutely. Whatever they need." This was her life now. Not ease or luxury, though they had enough for comfort, but purpose, the chance to help every single day in ways that mattered, the opportunity to turn one man's wasted fortune into something that changed the world, one family at a time. "You ready for the day?" Henry asked, standing slowly, his old back protesting but manageable now with good medical care. Martha stood too, taking his offered hand. "Always. What are we doing today?" "Living," Henry said simply. "Living the way Walter never could, living without fear." They walked inside, ready for whatever the day would bring. 2 elderly people who'd lost everything and found something far more valuable than money. They'd found meaning. They'd found family. They'd found the courage to transform not just their own lives, but an entire community's future. And in a grave on the edge of Millbrook Cemetery, under a stone that now read Walter Brennan, 1914 to 1983, his fortune found its purpose. Perhaps a lonely man's spirit finally rested, knowing his life's work hadn't been wasted after all. Because sometimes the greatest treasure isn't what we find, it's what we do with it once we have the courage to share it with the world. Anyone can discover treasure, but it takes wisdom to understand that the greatest fortune isn't counted in dollars. It's measured in lives touched, communities healed, and legacies built on love instead of fear. Martha and Henry Caldwell were nobody special, just 2 old people who survived, who struggled, who were forgotten by the world until they found something that changed everything. But what made them extraordinary wasn't finding the fortune, it was giving it away. They understood what Walter Brennan never did, that wealth held tight becomes a prison, but wealth shared becomes wings. As the sun rises over Millbrook, Kansas, the town that was dying now thrives. The elderly who were invisible now have homes. The families drowning in debt now have hope. The children who thought education was impossible now have futures. And at the center of it all, in a modest house with a front porch and a garden, 2 people who once slept on dirt floors now sleep peacefully, knowing they kept their promise. To Walter, to each other, and to everyone who needed someone to believe that life could still be good. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories of hope and transformation. Click to keep discovering with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe kindness is the greatest treasure of all.